found in the, beside the platform in the railway station showed the murderer had come back into Victoria because John was confined to a wheelchair. Their 6-year-old son Arthur had to identify his mother's body. It was the morgue. It was in the basement of the police station. So what happened? The police tried everything to solve this murder, but there were no leads. This is before fingerprinting had been introduced, because of course her leather purse would have been an ideal place to find fingerprints. So they had to rely on witnesses or other evidence. Well, there were no witnesses, and that robbery was probably not the motive, because she would have only had $4 or $5 in her purse, which was her weekly wages. At any rate, the case has never been solved. Arthur was put in the Bishop Bridge orphanage because, of course, his father couldn't take care of him. John was put in the old men's home, where he lived until his death in 1916. He's buried here with Agnes. The Arthur, when he became old enough, was taken from the orphanage and adopted, put that in inverted commas, like Anne of Green Gables, by a farmer in the area of Port Alberni. He was unpaid labor. At any rate, when he was old enough to get out away from the farm, he returned to Victoria and lived the rest of his life here. On one of my earliest murder tours, I told the story at this grave, which was unmarked. And Arthur's children, adult children, were on that tour. They had wondered where Granny was buried. They knew how she had died. Arthur, of course, didn't know where she was, because he wouldn't have been at the funeral. And the net result, they erected this headstone, which is why I feel a personal connection to it. At any rate, this reeks of Jack the Ripper. It's entirely possible that the unnamed murderer was indeed Jack the Ripper. Jack the Ripper had been active in London about 10 years earlier. And in 1899, you could get anywhere on the face of the earth that was inhabited by what would be called civilized people in 30 days from anywhere else, because there were frequent sailings, steamships, and there were railways going everywhere. So someone from London couldn't come here. A friend of mine who's a Crown prosecutor said that she believed that this murder had been committed by a serial killer. It had all the marks of it. At any rate, if you want to write a novel, this is a case perhaps to base on. Now we shall head across the cemetery, next part of the tour. Unfortunately, and murderers are not, or murder victims are not buried in the same place. The next lot are a little bit closer apart, but they're a distance away. You can admire the scenery while we're heading off to where we have to go. This is the grave of Ernest Lionel Lawrence. Died age 20. He was a clerk at the Royal Bank, Government Street. The bank, of course, now Monroe's bookstore. He was staying late on February 28th, 1923. Make sure that all of the accounts were balanced for month-end statements. Well, on his way home, when he got off the streetcar at Amphion Street, he was accosted by Ronald Smith, who was 17, and Thomas Burton, who was age 15. They were intent on robbery. They had a gun, or both of them had a gun. They were revolvers which had been stolen from a pawn shop on the previous night. Unfortunately, Ernest Lawrence attempted to resist. He had no money. And the kids shot him dead. They were quickly arrested because they disposed of the guns by throwing them in the bushes and fled on bicycles. Well, the police were able to find the guns. They were able to fingerprint them. They had the evidence from the previous night's robbery where they broke into the pawn shop, and they had their fingerprints because both of them had been in trouble with the law previously. They were put on trial. There was no Young Offenders Act at that time, so they were tried as adults for murder, and convicted, and sentenced to BC Penn. Well, they befriended a convict in there who was likewise in there for fairly serious crimes, and formulated a plan to escape. They escaped by hiding in a dumpster, which was taken by the New Westminster municipal garbage collectors and went to the dump. Well, the three convicts got a trip to the dump. Now, they must have had Confederates on the outside because they got clean clothes. They headed to the border. And of course, in those days, the border was not heavily guarded. Even to this day, there isn't a fence over large parts of it. So you go to Zero Avenue in Surrey and walk, which is exactly what they did. They went to Seattle, and that's where they disappeared. That the older convict was quickly captured by the Seattle police, returned to the BC Penn. The two younger ones, Burton and Smith, were not caught. They vanished. The province put up a reward of $1,000 in 1923, would be a sizable sum of money, for information leading to their arrest and return to prison. It's never been collected. It's probably worth a great deal now because it's been sitting in the province's bank account gaining interest. It's likely that they never returned to Canada and created false identities in the States, died there. Because both of them would be over 100 years old now, so it's unlikely that they're alive. Anyway, we'll go see the next murder victim. It's not too far away, and this took place on the same day as Agnes King. This is the unmarked grave of Michael Powers. He was 40 years old. He was manager of the Garrett Head Pub in Bastion Street, which is, of course, still there. He walked home. He was confronted out in front of his house at 849 Fort Street, sandbagged and kicked. The attack was witnessed by a passing cab who could not, and the cab driver could not identify the attacker. The unconscious man was taken to hospital, and the initial diagnosis had concussion. When he was able to talk to the police, Howard said he knew who attacked him, but he was going to deal with the assailant. Unfortunately, the kick he received in the gut ruptured his intestine. This was not spotted at the time of his initial examination. In fact, it wasn't spotted until he developed peritonitis. Well, he died of peritonitis. The case is officially not solved, but the police had information that led them to believe that Claude Latfoot McMickey, the ne'er-do-well son of Robert McMickey, who was one of the police commissioners, had been involved in a love triangle with Howard's wife. But there was no that the police could lay charges, and without an ironside case, because of the social and political position of the assailant's parents, that McMickey died fairly young. He drank himself to death. But this is an unsolved case, officially still an unsolved case. Now we're going to go down this way on the road. This is the currently unmarked grave of William Carroll. William Carroll was one of the gold miners who struck it rich at Leechtown in the 1864 gold rush. But gold is not what brought about his death in April of 1907, where he was aged 65. It was a love triangle, a rather odd love triangle, because the center of the triangle was a 45-year-old widow named Mrs. Mary Cowgill. And the other corner of the triangle was Donald Mackay, who was a 25-year-old stoker on the steamer Otter. That's not the Hudson's Bay steamer Otter. It's another boat. At any rate, Mackay disapproved of the relationship with between Mrs. Cowgill and Tyrrell because she was white and that Tyrrell was black. He had been the police had been called because he was causing a disturbance outside Tyrrell's house on North Road, Spring Ridge. So it isn't as if there hadn't been some warning. At any rate, what happened was that on April 18th, Mrs. Cowgill had dinner at Tyrrell's house. Later that evening, Tyrrell became ill. So Mrs. Cowgill said, I'll sit up with you. About 3 in the morning, Mackay broke in and attacked Mrs. Cowgill. Tyrrell got out of bed to protect his friend. That Mackay turned on him. Mrs. Cowgill fled. She was too frightened to go to the police, but the police were summoned the next morning by a neighbor. They found a scene of blood and destruction and immediately sought the 2 other parties involved. Mrs. Cowgill was arrested at the corner of Yates and Douglas as she was about to board the number 3 Fernwood streetcar to go home. Mackay was found on board ship. He tried to blame the murder on another sailor named Harry Stevens, possibly believing that Mrs. Cowgill was too frightened to point the finger at him. At any rate, it didn't wash, and the trial proceeded. Now that Mackay was tried, but there was evidence that the other sailor had stated it's a good thing that Tyrrell was dead, raising some doubt to the veracity of her account. So that the conviction didn't occur. That the fate of Mary Cowgill is unknown. She left town. William Tyrrell's funeral was paid for by John Giscombe, who had been, of course, another gold seeker back in the 1860s. But Giscombe had money. This is why I think there probably was a marker here, which has long since been destroyed. But that's the story of the murder of William Tyrrell. Now we're going to go down this way to our most recent murder. This is the grave of Tanya Van Kleinberg. She was murdered in 1987. The case is something that really is like a story out of a television mystery. So, that Tanya and her uh, boyfriend Jay Cook left her Saanich home on November 18th to go to Seattle to buy plumbing parts. They were last seen. They traveled via Port Angeles. They were last seen alive boarding the Bremerton ferry. At some point, they met a man called William Talbot. Police believe this is likely to have been aboard the Port Townsend to Bremerton boat, and that they offered him a ride. At any rate, on November 24th, Tanya's body was found in a ditch. She'd been tied up with plastic zip ties, raped, and shot in the head. Jay's body was found 2 days later. 60 miles away, he had been strangled and beaten with a rock. The van was found in Bellingham on the 25th, the day before they found Jay's body. The condition of the van was such that it was obvious that the murderer was thumbing his nose at the police. There were no fingerprints other than the 2 murder victims in the van. There was a pair of rubber gloves, obviously being worn by the murderer. There were the plastic zip ties and various other items. It would, as the police said, it was likely that he was saying, "You can't catch me." Police had DNA with no fingerprints. Unfortunately, in 1967, there wasn't a very great file of DNA, so that they couldn't identify it. The case was cold until 2013, almost 30 years after the date of the murder. What happened in the interval is the idea of DNA genealogy had become popular. And the police were able to produce a match DNA samples that they had with the evidence base that the genealogy provided. And by tracing descent, they were able to identify a possible suspect. So they put a watch out for him. And what happened? They were able to collect a discarded drink cup that the murderer had used. They tested it, and they had a DNA sample. And he was arrested and put on trial. He had been in jail before, but that was before they took DNA samples from convicts. So, but they now had it. The trial was concluded. I don't know at what point. I understand that you lost sound. I don't know what point in the story you lost out. But at any
convict.
Yes,
DNA.
yes, he had that that DNA is taken from convict. Now he was, but not of course when the accused was in jail. In the interval, they used the DNA samples filed with the genealogy sites to find a suspect, and then put a watch out might get the DNA of the person they suspected. They found a discarded paper cup that he used for drinking something. They tested it. Bingo, it was a match. He was put on trial and convicted of both murders and got 2 life sentences, served consecutively. So this is a murder that has been solved by a method right out of a Vera Stanhope mystery. Now,
Sorry about the noise. We're right by Dallas Road.
this is the grave of Dulcie Magdalene Hannah. She was 34 years old when she died. She came here in 1929 from the island of Jersey in the Channel Islands. And with her husband, Ernest Hannum, and a daughter named Georgina, who was 2 years old at the time. By 1938, the Hannums had separated, and Georgina and Dulcie were living as a tenant with a carpenter named Raymond Wright in Towton Street. She was found dead with her throat cut on Colville Road, Esquimalt, on January 27, 1939. Shortly thereafter, Wright was found with his throat and wrist cut in his car at in Tyee Road. He was still alive. He was taken to the Jubilee Hospital, and thanks to modern medicine, he was expected to live. On January 31st, he was charged with murder. The was adjourned until such time he was released from hospital. So the trial was set mid-March. The Crown proceeded with circumstantial evidence and thought that jealousy was the reason. That Dulcie had been seen with various men in recent days, and that the scarves that had been found at the scene of the crime, which had Dulcie's blood on it, were gifts which had been exchanged between Dulcie and Raymond at Christmas. The jury voted to convict, which was upheld on appeal, and the counsel for the accused asked for clemency on grounds that this was a crime of passion. The appellate court didn't buy it, and that the net result, Wright was hanged at Ocala in June. Ernest, the husband of Dulcie, remarried and is buried in Royal Oak. Georgina has disappeared from record, but she very well may be still alive. Now, we'll head off this way. This is the grave of Salvatore Andrea, with age 27. Found dead of a gunshot wound about a half a mile from the Goldstream Hotel on Sunday, October 24th, 1909. He'd not died at that place. The body had been dumped there. He had come to Victoria from Italy via Chicago and Seattle, and at the time of his death was employed by Parfit Brothers. He had met with some other Italian construction workers a couple of days previous, and something was discussed. He left them and took the train to Goldstream. He met some other Italians who were working on the road and went away with them. That he was never seen again. The various people who could have been witnesses either said they saw nothing or they couldn't be found. When the provincial police investigated, they found cash and a passbook containing several $100s in the bank, so it was robbery. Police believe that Andrea ran afoul of the Camorra, which is the Calabrian equivalent of the Sicilian mafia. He probably had met with the people to try to buy safety, but the people he'd met to, who were the Alvaro brothers, uh, disappeared. It was reported they had been seen in Vancouver, but haven't been seen since. And there was $1,000 reward for information, but none could be provided. So this is another one that you could write a mystery novel about. The mafia murder in Gold Street.
Okay.
The Dick. He never been solved. Jane Dick was a partial invalid, housebound. Our cleaning lady, whose name was Janet Pollock, came every Wednesday. But on the day that she came, seemed to be at home and didn't let her in. She came back the next day. Called the police. On Friday, June 23rd, the police found the body. She had been beaten to death in her bed. There were no
Sorry, folks, we seem to have lost them temporarily. Stay with us. Hopefully they'll get themselves organized.
What the police found in the house was an iron bar probably used as a poker covered with Jane Dick's blood, but no fingerprints. The murderer had obviously worn gloves, and every surface in the house that could have had fingerprints on it had been washed to remove them. It's obvious that Jane Dick knew the murderer because she had to let him in. He could have let himself out and locked the door with a snap. Jane Dick had two sons who lived in Vancouver. Their names are Alan and Albert. They could account for where they had been at the time of the murder. The only key that could have been used by the murderer to let him or herself in was one that was in the possession of Albert Dick, and of course the other which belonged to Jane Dick, and she had it in her possession at the time she died. So the question is, who killed Jane Dick? Why did they do it? Robbery doesn't seem to have been the motive. The case is unsolved. This is the grave of Alice Young. Her husband, Archie Young, is buried over there. You can just see the yellow flag posted to the road. That what I will do is tell the story because they're both involved at Archie's grave rather than Alice's, because it'll get us up this way quicker. So this is the grave of Archie Young. He was a teamster working for the West Home Lumber Company. He was 29 years old. This is in 1914. Alice age 21, who was buried over there, was his wife. They lived in an upstairs suite in Douglas Street. It was, I think, obvious from the evidence that Alice was a woman with a past, because she had become bored with trying to make a do on Archie's wages. She packed her bags and left him and went off to Vancouver, to Alexander Street, which is a part of town which in those days was definitely the red light district. Archie wanted Alice back, so he got on the next boat to Vancouver, went over there, and arrived at the house that Alice was in with a gun, banged on the door, demanding that Alice come home with him. Well, Alice didn't want to. The madam of the establishment phoned the police. The police arrived, and one thing led to the other, and they shot Archie in the foot to get him to basically put down the gun. Well, he was taken to hospital, but there was no way that his foot could be saved because the bullet had struck him in the ankle and shattered it. So his foot was amputated. Alice returned to Victoria and to Archie when Archie was released from hospital. And things seemed to be all right. But what happened is that Archie was going to go make another trip to Vancouver. And this was to get fitted with an artificial foot so that he could continue his work. Well, on the day that he was going to go, Alice announced that she was leaving him. She'd accompany him as far as Vancouver, but she wasn't going to come back. Well, there was an argument, and very likely Archie picked up a knife and stabbed Alice. He then cut his throat. The neighbors heard the commotion, summoned the police, brought an ambulance, but Archie died on the way to hospital. So that they were both buried here, but not together. So that's the story of Archie and Alice. Now we're going to go further on that way. This is the grave of Violet Simmons. This is Violet and her husband Arthur had a restaurant called the London Cafe, which was just down the block from Rogers Chocolates in Government Street. Violet was subject to stalking by a man called Robert Morgan, who had a passion for her, which Violet did not reciprocate. She'd done nothing to lead him on. When Violet was alone in the restaurant on November 27th, 1919, her husband was upstairs in their flat with their children. Morgan entered the restaurant, drew a gun, and shot Violet dead. He then turned it on himself and suicided. So this is another case where it's known who did the murder, but the murderer never went on trial. At any rate, this I found out about simply because on one of these tours in the past, one of the participants is a tour, a tour taker, whatever you want to call them, at any rate said, "Do you know about the murder of my Auntie Vi?" And I said, "No." And so he proceeded to tell me the story of what happened to Auntie Vi. Well, Violet and Arthur are buried here, but there's no marker. So that's the story of what happened. Now we're going to go up here for our last two stories. Yes. At 8 in the evening on March 5th, 1933, the Oak Bay police had a telephone call from a man called George Lovett, who lived in Milton Street. He said that he had shot and wounded George Colson, who's buried here, with a shotgun. When the police arrived, they found Lovett holding a revolver, not a shotgun. The shotgun and the revolver had both been discharged. Colson was standing in the kitchen bleeding, and Jessie Lovett's wife was lying fainted on the floor. Colson and Jessie were taken to the Jubilee Hospital. Colson lived for 3 days, but the police had obtained statements from both him and Jessie prior to his death. The charges were fast-tracked so that the case went to court quite quickly. The strange thing about it is that while Jessie had claimed, yes, that she'd had marital problems with her husband, and that she was had asked Colson to take her away, Uh, she was charged along with her husband with the murder. Uh, as well, the the gun and the shotgun had fingerprints from all three of them on them. So the police had no way of proving who had fired what. And of course, the ballistic evidence was relatively useless because it would have shown where the gun likely was, but unless you have some idea who had been holding it, the net result is that both Lovitz were charged, they were convicted, uh, but not for murder. They were sentenced uh, uh, on a lesser charge and eventually uh, released. They uh, continued to live in the house in Oak Bay till they died, and they are buried in this cemetery near the grave of Agnes Bing. I mean, this could have been told there, but I think it was the place to do it this time. At least was at the grave of the man that was actually murdered. This is cool. Now, our last grave is right behind there. This is the grave of Cora and George Anderson. At 1 a.m. on August 22nd, 1915, Cora Anderson murdered her husband, George. She murdered him with an axe as he lay sleeping in their house at 35 Lewis Street in James Bay. She laid the axe on the blanket silk bed, shut the door, locked it, and then sat at the kitchen table and wrote 3 letters. One to her mother, one to her sister, and each of her 2 sisters. She put the letters in envelopes, put stamps on the ones that were going to the sisters who lived in Alberta, and the one for her mother, she didn't need to put a stamp on it because her mother lived in Victoria. At 7 a.m., their children awoke. She fed them breakfast. She gave the oldest one some money for car fare. and the envelope addressed to her grandmother. They were to go to Granny's house in Kings Road, which is what they did. Cora then, once they were gone, put on her hat and coat, walked out the door, and jumped off the breakwater and drowned herself. Well, now, how had this come about? Cora was a member of a religious group that was similar to the Jehovah's Witnesses. I don't know whether it was the Jehovah's Witnesses, but the pastor had preached that the world was coming to the end in 1914, which Pastor Russell of the JW did as well. So this is why I think that she may have been a JW. I don't know that. At any rate, she was convinced that since this was the end of times, and of course the newspapers with the news of the war were pointing toward verifying this, that she had to convert her husband, but her husband wouldn't have any of it. He did not buy her reading of the Bible. He took her to the doctor. The doctor said, what you need to do is you need to rest. And he suggested that she go stay with her sister on the farm in Alberta, and where it was nice and calm, she'd have fresh air, fresh country food, and perhaps recover her senses. Well, unfortunately, that didn't work, because when she came back to Victoria, she had formed the opinion that her husband was actually in league with the devil, and thus was the reason she did him in. She wrote it out in her letter to her mother, explaining exactly what happened. And I heard about this from one of those children. So I hope you enjoyed this Murder Most Foul tour that took us to parts of the cemetery we usually don't get to.
All right. Okay, thank you everybody for coming. We'll be signing off here in the cemetery, and we'll see you all next week.
Well, thanks again, Liz, for coordinating all that. And we'll look forward to next week. Sounds good. Thanks everyone for coming. Thank you for your patience. We're getting it. We're getting better every week.
This is great. I hope it keeps up every week.